"She has no place at that table," the Duke of Allister said. The words were a low murmur, a private assessment delivered to his oldest confidant, Viscount Satterfield, and meant to be absorbed by the damask-hung walls of the private dining room. They were not meant for the air. They were certainly not meant for the ears of the Prime Minister. But the Prime Minister, a man whose political survival depended on his ability to hear the whispers beneath the roars, heard them perfectly. He paused, his hand hovering over the back of his own chair. His gaze, sharp and analytical, slid from the Duke's impassive face to the subject of his dismissal. Miss Eleanor Vance stood near the door, a study in beige and quietude, waiting for the scrum of titled gentlemen to sort themselves into their proper hierarchy around the polished mahogany. She was, Allister had decided, precisely what he required. Her father's faction held 3 key votes on the upcoming Corn Laws repeal. Her dowry was substantial enough to refurbish the north wing of Blackwood Manor, and she was, by all accounts, biddable, silent, uncomplicated, a political and domestic convenience packaged in a serviceable, if uninspired, frame. He had observed her across 2 ballrooms and 1 stilted afternoon tea. She did not chatter. She did not angle for attention. Her eyes, a shade of hazel he could only describe as non-committal, seemed to absorb the glitter and noise without reflecting any of it back. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. This quality, which others might have called dull, Allister catalogued as a virtue. His first wife had been a creature of high drama and higher passions, a supernova who had burned through his patience and her own life in less than 3 years, leaving him with a title in want of an heir, and a profound aversion to emotional extravagance. Eleanor Vance was the antidote to all that. She was prose after a lifetime of overwrought poetry. He had made his decision with the same cool logic he applied to crop rotation and investments in the burgeoning railways. The arrangement was proposed. The families, eager for the alliance, accepted with an alacrity that bordered on unseemly. And now, here they were, at a dinner intended to celebrate the union, to present a united front to the arbiters of Westminster. Allister saw the seating plan as a map of power, the Prime Minister at the head, himself at the right hand. Other key ministers and allies arranged in descending order of influence. The women, his mother and sister included, were strategically placed to facilitate conversation and soften the hard edges of politics. But Miss Vance, his intended, his future Duchess, had been inexplicably seated far down the table, between a junior treasury clerk and a deaf old baronet. It was an oversight, a social miscalculation by the hostess, an irrelevance, hence his comment. It was a statement of fact, not of malice. She had no place at that table, the table of consequence where deals were struck and futures decided. Her value was in her name, her father, her silence. Her presence at the table itself was a mere formality. The Prime Minister's quiet smile was a dangerous thing. It held no mirth. It was a scalpel. He looked at Allister, then at Miss Vance, and a flicker of something disappointment, perhaps, or calculation passed through his eyes. He then did something extraordinary. He walked the length of the table, his progress tracked by a sudden baffled silence. The clink of silver on china ceased. Conversations faltered. He stopped directly behind the chair to Allister's left, a place of honor second only to his own right. It was the seat intended for the Home Secretary. With a deliberation that drew every eye in the room, the Prime Minister pulled the chair out. He did not beckon. He did not call her name. He simply waited, his gaze fixed on Eleanor Vance. For a moment, she did not seem to comprehend. She looked at the Prime Minister, then at the Duke, her expression unreadable. A flush, faint as watercolor, rose on her cheeks. It was not the blush of a giddy girl singled out for attention. It was the hot, slow tide of profound mortification. She understood. She had been unseated by her host's carelessness, dismissed by her fiancé, and was now being publicly rescued by the most powerful man in the country. It was not an honor. It was a spectacle. But Eleanor Vance was not, it turned out, a creature of inaction. She moved. With a poise that surprised Alistair, she crossed the room. Her steps were neither hurried nor hesitant. She gave a small, perfect curtsy to the Prime Minister. "You are too kind, sir," she said. Her voice was low, but it carried in the unnaturally quiet room. It held no tremor. "Nonsense, Miss Vance," the Prime Minister replied, his voice a warm counterpoint to the room's chill. "A woman of your insight belongs at the center of the conversation. I was just telling the Duke how much I valued your father's last paper on the German tariffs, though I suspect the most astute points originated closer to home." Alistair stared. He had read that paper. It was dense, brilliant, and uncharacteristically sharp for the plodding, amiable man who was to be his father-in-law. The idea that this quiet beige girl had authored its finer points was ludicrous. Eleanor inclined her head, a gesture that could have been agreement or simple acknowledgement. "My father and I enjoy robust debate, Prime Minister." She sat. The Prime Minister pushed her chair in, a gesture of chivalry so pointed it was an act of political aggression. He then returned to his own seat, leaving Alistair to stare at the profile of the woman who was now his neighbor. The dinner conversation resumed, but the landscape had changed. The tectonic plates of power had shifted. The Duke of Alistair, a man who prided himself on his supreme command of every situation, had been publicly corrected, and the instrument of his correction was the silent, uncomplicated woman he had chosen for her very lack of consequence. He felt a prickle of irritation, hot and unwelcome. He had been made to look like a fool. Worse, he had been made to look brutish. He glanced at Eleanor. She was listening intently to the Home Secretary, who had taken her original, lowly seat, and now had to lean forward to be heard. Her plate was untouched. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was a statue of perfect composure. But Alistair, for the first time, noticed something. He noticed the infinitesimal tension in her jaw. He noticed the rigid line of her spine. And he noticed that her noncommittal hazel eyes, when she thought no one was looking, were fixed on the polished surface of the table, seeing not her own reflection, but something far, far beyond. He had wanted a quiet duchess. He was beginning to suspect he had profoundly misunderstood the nature of silence. Their first formal interaction as an engaged couple, a week later, took place in the neutral territory of her father's London library. It was a room that smelled of old leather and beeswax, a masculine space that seemed to tolerate her presence rather than welcome it. Alistair arrived with the express purpose of finalizing the marriage settlements with her father. He had allocated precisely 15 minutes for a private conversation with his fiancée afterward. It was a duty, like inspecting a tenant farm or sitting through a tedious debate in the Lords. He found her not by the fire, engaged in the feminine art of needlepoint, but at her father's enormous desk, a ledger open before her. She was making notations in a small, neat hand, a frown of concentration on her brow. She did not immediately notice his entrance. The sheer focus of her attention was peculiar. He was accustomed to women who were acutely aware of a man's presence, whose entire posture shifted when a duke entered the room. Eleanor simply continued her work. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice colder than he intended. She started, a pen leaving a small black star on the page. She looked up, her face betraying a flash of unguarded annoyance, before being smoothed into a mask of placid neutrality. "Your Grace, I was not expecting you so soon. My business with your father was concluded," he stated. He gestured toward the ledger. "An unusual pastime. I help my father manage the estate accounts," she said simply, closing the book. The finality of the gesture was a locked door. He felt that same prickle of irritation from the dinner. It was the feeling of being confronted with a door he had not known existed, let alone one that was being closed in his face. He had come here expecting to bestow his attention upon her. Instead, he felt as though he were interrupting something important. "A commendable display of filial duty," he said, the compliment curdling into condescension. "You will find the Blackwood ledgers are managed by a very competent man, a Mr. Hobbs. Your time will be your own." "I am glad to hear it," she replied, her tone perfectly even. An awkward silence fell. He had planned to speak of the wedding, of the move to the country, of her new duties as his duchess. He had a script in his mind, a series of benevolent pronouncements, but the script felt flimsy now, inadequate. He was speaking to a woman who balanced estate ledgers, who debated German tariffs with the Prime Minister. Or did she? The thought was still so absurd he could not quite accept it. "The Prime Minister," he began, deciding to confront the matter head-on. "Made a rather pointed comment at dinner." "Indeed," she said. She did not elaborate. "He seemed to be under the impression that you are some sort of political savant." The words came out with a faintly mocking edge. He was testing her, probing for the soft vanity he assumed must lie beneath the quiet exterior. Eleanor met his gaze directly. For the first time since he had met her, he felt the full, unshielded force of her perception. Her eyes were not non-committal at all. They were analytical. They were weighing him. "The Prime Minister is a discerning man," she said. "He understands that a person's value is not always announced with trumpets. Sometimes it is found in the margins, in the footnotes, in the figures of a ledger that reveal a tenant farmer is planting the wrong crop for the soil and will face ruin come winter." The specificity of the example caught him off guard. It was not a vague, philosophical statement. It was a diagnosis. Alistair felt a sudden, sharp recalibration in his own mind. He had walked in expecting to converse with a placeholder, a symbol. He was instead faced with a mind that ran on facts and figures and practical, observable truths. The dismissive letter he had already drafted in his head to his solicitor, a quiet duchess for a quiet house, her mind of no consequence, suddenly seemed not merely callous, but foolish. He changed tack. "You follow the debates on agriculture, then?" "I follow the lives that depend on them," she countered softly. "The price of grain is not an abstract concept when you have reviewed the household budget for a family of 8. He had to admit, impressed. Reluctantly. It was the kind of clear-eyed, unsentimental pragmatism he valued in men. To find it in a woman, and this woman, of all women, was disorienting. He had chosen her for her silence, assuming it signified an absence of thought. It was slowly dawning on him that it might, instead, signify a surplus of it, that she was quiet not because she had nothing to say, but because she had deemed most people unworthy of hearing it. The thought was both humbling and, to his own profound surprise, intriguing. "The Blackwood estates are extensive," he found himself saying, the words straying from his prepared script. "The soil in the west is clay-heavy. We have struggled with drainage for generations." He did not know why he said it. It was a confession of a problem, a crack in the facade of ducal perfection. Eleanor's gaze sharpened with genuine interest. The mask of polite indifference fell away, revealing the keen intelligence beneath. "Have you considered planting alder trees along the low-lying pastures? Their root systems are remarkable at absorbing excess water. And there is a Dutch method of deep ditching that costs a fraction of traditional tile drainage, though it requires more frequent maintenance." She spoke with the unself-conscious authority of an expert. Alistair, who had spent a fortune on engineers and surveyors to address that very problem, could only stare. The silence that followed was different. It was not awkward. It was filled with the weight of his own dawning realization. The 15 minutes he had allocated for this meeting stretched to an hour. He did not speak of the wedding. He did not lay out her duties. They spoke of crop rotation and soil composition and the surprising profitability of merino sheep. When he finally took his leave, he felt a sense of dislocation, as if the world he had so confidently mapped had been revealed as a crude and inaccurate drawing. As he walked down the steps of her father's house into the London gloom, a single, unwelcome thought lodged itself in his mind. He had chosen Eleanor Vance to be a quiet adornment to his life. It was becoming increasingly clear that he may have, entirely by accident, acquired a partner. The prospect was both terrifying and, in a way he could not yet admit, exhilarating. The wedding was a grand, impersonal affair, a state event in miniature. Alistair stood at the altar, watching Eleanor walk toward him on her father's arm. In the white silk and lace of a duchess, she was transformed. The beige had been stripped away, revealing a pale, austere beauty he had not previously noticed. But it was her eyes that held him. They were not the eyes of a blushing bride. They were the eyes of a general surveying a battlefield upon which she was compelled to fight. She was composed, regal, and utterly remote. Their new life at Blackwood Manor began. It was a life of impeccable surfaces. The Duchess performed her duties with a quiet efficiency that won the immediate and fervent loyalty of the staff. Meals were on time. The household ran with a smoothness Alistair had never known. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper who had served his family for 40 years and had weathered the storms of his first marriage with grim stoicism, offered a rare and glowing verdict. Her Grace, your Grace, is a master of the house. She sees everything. Alistair heard the unspoken addendum. She sees everything. Unlike you. He found himself observing his new wife. He watched her in the gardens, where she spent hours with the head gardener, not merely giving orders, but discussing, learning, her hands tracing the leaves of a struggling rosebush. He heard the sound of the pianoforte drifting from the music room in the evenings. Intricate pieces by Scarlatti played with a technical precision that bespoke years of disciplined practice. He came upon her in the library, surrounded by books on engineering, history, and economics, her face alive with a concentration that rendered her oblivious to his presence. She was a collection of surprising competencies, a woman of hidden depths, and yet she kept those depths hidden from him. With him, she was polite, correct, and distant. She was the perfect duchess of his initial design, and it was beginning to feel like a cage. The silence he had so coveted now seemed like a judgment. The inciting error, when it came, was a product of his old arrogance, a ghost from the man he had been just a few weeks prior. He was in his study, clearing out a portfolio of correspondence, when he came across the letter. It was a draft, written to his solicitor, penned in the days just after his engagement was settled, but before the fateful dinner. Before he had been forced to truly see her. He read the words, his own confident, dismissive script mocking him from the page. The arrangements for the Vance union are satisfactory. Proceed with the settlements as discussed. The girl herself is of little account, plain but well connected, and possessed of a quietude that will be a mercy after the last affair. I require a duchess to produce an heir and manage my table, not to entertain me with opinions. Her mind, such as it is of no consequence. A quiet duchess for a quiet house. See that the marriage articles are ironclad. A wave of cold shame washed over him. It was a brutal, callous assessment. It was the assessment of a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. He remembered the night he wrote it, the sense of smug satisfaction at having solved the problem of his remarriage so efficiently. His first instinct was to burn it, to destroy the evidence of his own stupidity. But he was interrupted by a footman announcing an unscheduled visitor. Cursing the interruption, Alistair folded the letter hastily and slid it under a silver letter opener on his desk, intending to return to it later. He then forgot all about it. He did not see Eleanor enter his study an hour later, searching for a book on local geography she had seen on his shelves. He did not see her notice the folded letter, its corner peeking out from beneath the ornate weight. He did not see the flicker of curiosity, the assumption that it was a household matter she might need to attend to. He did not see her unfold it. He did not see her read it. Eleanor stood perfectly still in the center of the vast, silent study. The tick of the great clock in the hall was the only sound. The paper in her hand did not tremble. She read the words once, then a second time, not in disbelief, but for confirmation. Each phrase was a chisel, chipping away at the fragile, tentative foundations of the life she had begun to build. The girl herself is of little account, plain but well connected. Her mind, such as it is of no consequence. There was no shock. There was no surge of hot, furious anger. There was only a profound and terrible clarity. It was the feeling of a physician looking at a clear diagram of a disease. It explained everything. His initial dismissal at the dinner, his surprise in her father's library, his recent, tentative interest, which she had cautiously begun to interpret as a change of heart. It was not a change of heart. It was merely the surprise of a man who had purchased what he thought was a simple plow horse and discovered it could solve mathematical equations. His interest was not in her, the woman, but in her unexpected utility. She had been a fool to hope for more. She had allowed the Prime Minister's grand gesture, the Duke's flicker of intellectual engagement, the simple beauty of the gardens at Blackwood, to seduce her into a state of optimism. She had begun to unpack her heart, cautiously, like precious china after a long journey. Now, she saw her mistake. With the same neat precision she used on the estate ledgers, she folded the letter back along its original creases. She slid it carefully back into its place beneath the silver letter opener. A silent, damning piece of evidence returned to its crime scene. She had not been meant to see it, but she had, and knowledge, once gained, could not be ungained. It was a part of the calculation now. She turned and walked out of the study. She did not slam the door. She did not weep. A door closed quietly inside her. It was a heavy door, an old door, one she had learned to close long ago to protect the small, bright room of her own mind from the casual cruelty of the world. She had thought, perhaps, in this new life, she might be able to leave it open. She was wrong. That evening, for the first time since her arrival, the music room remained silent. Alistair noticed the absence of the Scarlatti sonatas first. He was in his study, a glass of port at his elbow. The day's parliamentary reports spread before him. Usually, the music would begin around 9, a complex crystalline sound that wove itself into the fabric of the evening. It had become a background noise he had started to rely on, a signal that the day was drawing to a close, that all was well within the walls of his domain. Tonight, there was only the oppressive tick of the clock. He felt a strange, unfounded sense of unease. He told himself it was nothing. She was likely tired, or had a headache. A rational explanation. But the next night, the silence returned, and the night after that. Then he began to notice other things. Small things, at first. Insignificant. The flowers were gone. Eleanor had developed a habit of keeping a small, simple vase of whatever was in season on the breakfast table. White roses, then lavender, then the last of the autumn dahlias. It was a small touch of life in the formal, cavernous dining room. Now, the table was bare, adorned only with the heavy ducal silver. At dinner, their conversations had become, in recent weeks, a cautious sort of sparring ground. He would bring up a political issue, and she would offer a perspective so oblique and intelligent, it would force him to reconsider his own. He had, to his own astonishment, begun to look forward to it. Now, that was gone too. She answered his questions with polite monosyllables. She offered no opinions. She kept her eyes on her plate. She was present, and she was absent. She was the woman he had first seen at the London dinner, a ghost at her own table. He had gotten what he thought he wanted, a quiet duchess. The silence was deafening. The house itself seemed to feel it. The atmosphere grew heavier, more formal. The servants, who had blossomed under her clear, kind direction, seemed more reserved, their movements more constrained. Mrs. Croft's face was a mask of granite disapproval whenever she looked at him. The entire estate, which had begun to feel like a home, had reverted to being merely a house, a grand, cold, perfectly run museum. Alistair found himself wandering the corridors, a stranger in his own life. He would pass the closed door of the music room and feel an illogical pang of loss. He walked through the gardens, and they seemed less vibrant, as if the color had been leached from the petals. He went to the library and found the books she had been reading, the treatise on Roman aqueducts, the history of the wool trade, all neatly reshelved. their spines flush and undisturbed. It was as if she were systematically erasing every trace of her true self from the house. He was a man who solved problems. This was a problem. He tried to address it directly. "You have not played the pianoforte this week, Eleanor," he said one evening, attempting a tone of casual concern. "I have not felt inclined to," she replied, not looking up from her needlepoint. It was the first time he had seen her engaged in the pastime, and the sight of it filled him with a sudden, violent irritation. It was a caricature of the woman he was beginning to know. "Are you unwell?" he pressed. "I am perfectly well. Your Grace, Your Grace." She had stopped using his name. He was once again a title, a position. The distance between them was a chasm, and he had no idea how it had opened. He thought back, trying to pinpoint the moment of the shift. He replayed their conversations, their interactions. He could find no cause, no single event. It was a creeping frost that had stolen over their lives while he was not paying attention. The accumulation of clues was a slow torment. An untouched meal, an empty chair in the garden. The way she no longer met his eyes. He was a logician, a man who believed in cause and effect, and he was trapped in an effect for which he could not find the cause. The catalyst came, as it often does, from a third party. The Prime Minister came to Blackwood for a weekend of shooting and political strategy. He was a keen observer of human ecosystems, and he noticed the climate change in the Duke's household immediately. On the second evening, after Eleanor had retired, leaving the two men to their brandy, the Prime Minister swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Is your Duchess well, Alistair?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "She is in excellent health," Alistair replied stiffly. "Health is more than the absence of fever," the older man mused. "When I saw her in London, she was a tightly coiled spring of intellect and spirit. Now, she seems diminished, as if she has been put in a box too small for her. I had thought her a woman of rare spirit. It is a tragedy to see such a spirit caged." The words landed like stones. Diminished. A box too small for her. Caged. "She has everything a duchess could desire," Alistair said, the defensive words tasting like ash in his mouth. The Prime Minister gave him a long, pitying look. "My dear boy," he said, his voice laced with a weary kindness that was more damning than any rebuke. "You have been married twice. You should know by now that what a duchess desires and what a woman needs are often two very different things. You gave her a title and a house. I wonder, have you ever thought to give her your attention?" The question hung in the air long after the Prime Minister had gone to bed. Attention. He had been paying attention. He had noticed the silence, the flowers, the books. He had noticed the absence. But he had been looking at the symptoms, not the disease. He went to his study, the Prime Minister's words echoing in his mind. He sat at his desk, the sight of his own folly, and tried to think. When had it started? When had the music stopped? He traced the days back, a week, 10 days. It was the day after his meeting with the solicitor's clerk about the final transfer of her dowry funds. He had been in here, clearing his desk, and then he saw it. The letter. It was exactly where he had left it, tucked beneath the heavy silver letter opener. But it was different. He was a man of precise habits. He remembered folding it hastily, the creases uneven. Now, it was folded perfectly, the edges aligned with a geometric precision. It was the neat, careful fold of a woman who managed ledgers, a woman who restored order. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, pierced through him. He picked it up. He unfolded it. He read the hateful, arrogant words he had written in another lifetime. And he knew. This was the cause. This was the disease. She had read it. She had seen the black, transactional core of his heart, the measure of her worth in his eyes. He thought about her quiet competence, her fierce intelligence, her surprising wit. He thought about the way she had spoken of the Dutch drainage methods, her face lit with passion. He thought about the Scarlatti sonatas, played not for an audience, but for the sheer love of the music. He thought about the small vase of flowers, a quiet offering of beauty he had not even properly acknowledged. He thought about all the small, tentative ways she had been reaching out, trying to build a bridge across the chasm of their arranged union. And he had met her with this. Her mind, such as it is of no consequence. The epiphany was not a flash of lightning. It was a slow, sickening flood. He saw it all with horrifying clarity. His blindness, his arrogance, the casual cruelty of his dismissal. He had not just misjudged her, he had actively, carelessly wounded her. He had taken this rare, brilliant woman and informed her that she was nothing more than a serviceable broodmare and a household manager. He had praised the silence he mistook for emptiness, while she had been waiting, hoping, for him to prove he was worthy of her voice. He dropped his head into his hands. The great Duke of Allister, the master of his universe, felt the crushing weight of a single, unassailable truth. He was a fool, an absolute, irredeemable fool, and he had broken something precious, perhaps irrevocably. The silence in the house was not an absence of sound. It was the sound of her heart breaking. It was the sound of a door being locked, and he finally understood that he was the one who had turned the key. He had to find her. It was late, well past midnight. The house was submerged in a deep, watchful quiet. He did not know where she would be. Her bedroom was a sanctuary he had no right to invade. He found himself walking, drawn by some instinct he didn't understand, toward the west wing, toward the old, disused conservatory. He had passed it a dozen times, a relic of his grandfather's era, its glass panes clouded with grime, its interior a graveyard of dead vines and forgotten pots. He had marked it for demolition, but a few weeks ago he'd heard from a footman that the Duchess had requested the keys. He had thought nothing of it. Now, he saw a faint, flickering light through the dirty glass. He pushed open the groaning door. The air inside was cool and damp, thick with the smell of earth and decay. In the center of the vast domed room, a single lantern cast a pool of golden light. And in that light was Eleanor. She was on her knees, a trowel in her hand, surrounded by sacks of soil and clay pots. She had cleared a large section of the long-neglected planting beds. Her dress was smudged with dirt. Her hair had come loose from its pins, stray tendrils clinging to her neck. She was working with a fierce, solitary absorption, her hands moving through the dark, rich earth as if it were the only real thing in the world. This was her space, the one place in the entire vast estate that was wholly and truly hers, a place of quiet restoration, of bringing life back to dead things. He had given her a palace, and she had sought refuge in a ruin. The sound of the door closing made her look up. Her face in the lantern light was pale and stark. She saw him, and a shudder came down over her eyes. It was not fear or anger. It was a weariness so profound it physically hurt him to see it. She looked like a soldier who did not have the strength for one more battle. He did not approach her immediately. He stood by the door, the cold metal of the letter still in his hand. The space between them was filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and careless cruelties. "I came to say," he began, his voice rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. He had commanded men in battle. He had swayed Parliament. He had never felt so utterly without language. He stopped. Excuses and explanations were insults. There was only one thing to be said. He walked forward slowly, until he was standing at the edge of her circle of light. He held out the letter. "You read this." It was not a question. She looked at the paper, then back at his face. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She did not have to speak. Her silence was a comprehensive indictment. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not try to explain the man he had been when he wrote it. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the only way forward was through the wreckage of the truth. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, inadequate, yet they were the hardest he had ever spoken. "I was a blind, arrogant fool. I wrote that letter, and I believed it. I looked at you, and I saw a solution. a convenience. I did not see the woman. He paused, gathering his thoughts, forcing himself to articulate the enormity of his failure. I wanted a quiet duchess for a quiet house, and when the house fell silent, it was unbearable. I noticed the music had stopped. I noticed the flowers were gone. I noticed that the mind I had dismissed as being of no consequence was the most vital, compelling thing I had ever encountered. And I missed it. God help me, I missed it. He crouched down, not so close as to invade her space, but enough to lower himself to her level. He was no longer the Duke looking down from a great height. He was just a man, on the floor of a ruined conservatory in the middle of the night. I did not understand, he continued, his voice low and raw. I did not understand that your silence was not emptiness. It was a choice. It was you, waiting. And I failed the test. Spectacularly. Eleanor watched him, her expression unchanging. She had built a fortress around her heart, and these words were merely stones striking the outer walls. They made a sound, but they did not breach the defenses. He knew it was not enough. Words were easy. He needed an act, a demonstration, an atonement. The opportunity arrived a fortnight later at the Duchess of Richmond's annual ball, the glittering apex of the London season. Society had been watching the new Duke and Duchess of Allister with keen interest. They had noted her quietness, his new, watchful intensity. The whispers were varied. It was a love match. It was a disaster. She was terrified of him. He was besotted. Lord Bromwell, a man whose wit was far exceeded by his malice, and who had long considered himself Allister's rival, chose that evening to make his move. He cornered a small group that included Allister and Eleanor, who stood, as always, a picture of placid composure by her husband's side. "Allister, my dear fellow," Bromwell began with a languid smile, "one must congratulate you. You have found the perfect duchess, so decorative and wonderfully, blessedly silent. My own wife, alas, is plagued by opinions." He gave Eleanor a dismissive, pitying glance. It must be a great relief. The insult was deliberate, public, and designed to humiliate both of them, Eleanor for her quietness, and Allister for choosing such a seemingly insipid partner. In the past, Allister might have met such a jibe with a cutting remark or a cold shoulder, a duel of aristocratic hauteur. Tonight, he did something different. He smiled. It was a calm, pleasant smile that did not reach his eyes. He placed a hand gently on the small of Eleanor's back, a small, proprietary gesture that was also one of support. "You mistake the nature of my wife's silence, Bromwell," Allister said, his voice carrying easily in the small lull his smile had created. "It is not an absence of opinion. It is an absence of fools." A collective intake of breath rippled through the group. Bromwell's face flushed a dull, mottled red, but Allister had not finished. He turned his full attention to the sputtering lord. "In fact, just last week, the Duchess was explaining to me the fundamental flaw in your argument against the proposed canal tariffs. You claimed, 'I believe in the Lords, that it would harm the import of French silks. A matter of great import to your own coffers, I am sure.'" He didn't wait for a reply. My wife, however, who has actually studied the trade ledgers rather than simply profiting from them, pointed out that the vast majority of raw silk is, in fact, imported from the Ottoman Empire and Italy, and that the French primarily export finished goods, which are taxed under a completely different schedule. Your entire argument was based on a false premise. She described it as, I believe her words were, the sort of lazy thinking that bankrupts nations. He delivered the final line with a surgeon's precision. He was not just defending her. He was using her intellect as a weapon, wielding the very mind he had once dismissed. He was telling the world not just that she had opinions, but that her opinions had weight, substance, and the power to dismantle a lord in public. He looked down at Eleanor. "Is that a fair summary, my dear?" For the first time in weeks, A flicker of something other than weary resignation appeared in her eyes. It was a spark of her old dry wit, a glint of surprised admiration. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her mouth. "It is adequate, Your Grace," she murmured, the words for his ears alone. "Though you omitted the part about his grasp of economics being akin to a badger's understanding of astrophysics." Alistair's heart gave a painful lurch. It was the first time she had joked with him since the day she found the letter. It was a tiny crack in the ice. He turned back to the mortified Lord Bromwell. "There you have it," Alistair said cheerfully. "My wife, the Duchess of Alistair. Not merely decorative, I assure you. She is, in fact, the cleverest person in this room. And I recommend you remember that." He then took Eleanor's arm, nodded once to the stunned onlookers, and guided her away, leaving Lord Bromwell standing amidst the wreckage of his own social standing. It was a decisive, public act of atonement. He had not only seen her worth, he had proclaimed it. His public defense of her was a turning point, but it was not a conclusion. A fortress, Eleanor knew, was not dismantled by a single, well-aimed cannonball. The walls might be breached, but the sovereign of the keep did not immediately surrender. She did not capitulate. She did not rush into his arms. The smile at the ball had been a genuine flicker of warmth, an acknowledgement of his maneuver, but the deep, cold wound of his initial judgment remained. Trust, once shattered, had to be rebuilt piece by piece, like the mosaics on a Roman floor. Her condition was not spoken. It was lived. "Show me. Show me that this is not another performance. Show me that your admiration for my mind is not just another form of ownership. Show me that you see me, Eleanor, not merely the Duchess or the asset or the surprising intellect." And so, Alistair began the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding. It was a campaign waged not with grand gestures, but with the quiet currency of attention he had so long withheld. He started seeking her out in the conservatory. He would appear at the door not with pronouncements, but with a cup of tea or a rare botanical print he'd ordered from London. He did not offer advice. He asked questions. "What is this one called? Why do its leaves curl this way?" He learned the names of plants he'd never known existed: pelargoniums, fuchsias, the delicate, demanding gardenia. He listened as she explained the science of grafting, the art of nurturing a fragile seedling. He was not interested in botany. He was interested in the passion it ignited in her, the way her face transformed when she spoke of it. He began to leave things for her, not jewels or gowns, but books. A new translation of Marcus Aurelius. A dense government report on prison reform, with a single note attached. "I am at a loss. Your thoughts?" A folio of maps detailing the geology of their own estate. He was not asking for her help. He was inviting her mind to dance with his. One evening, he walked into the music room. The pianoforte stood silent, its lid closed and gathering a fine layer of dust. He did not ask her to play. He simply raised the lid, wiped the keys clean with his own handkerchief, and placed a single sheaf of sheet music on the stand. It was a Scarlatti sonata, one she had favored. Then he left. For 3 days, the music remained untouched. On the 4th evening, as he sat in his study, he heard it, faintly at first, then growing in confidence. The clear, complex, crystalline notes filled the house once more. It was not a performance, it was a conversation, a tentative answer to a long, unasked question. The rebuilding was slow, a delicate negotiation of space and trust. The silence between them changed. It was no longer a weapon or a shield. It became a comfortable quiet, the easy silence of two people sharing a room, each lost in their own thoughts, yet deeply aware of the other's presence. Their external world, however, did not wait. A political crisis, brewing for months, finally erupted. The repeal of the Corn Laws, the very issue that had first brought their families together, was facing a sudden, fierce opposition from a bloc of landed aristocrats. Eleanor's father, a key proponent of the repeal, was being politically isolated, his reputation threatened. One night, a frantic message arrived from London. The opposition had proposed a last-minute amendment, a poison pill designed to make the bill untenable. It was a clever, cynical move, and it was likely to work. Her father's career and the fate of the thousands who would suffer from inflated grain prices hung in the balance. Eleanor read the dispatch, her face pale and taut. Alistair watched her, saw the flicker of despair in her eyes. The old Alistair would have seen it as a political problem, an issue of votes and influence. The new Alistair saw the pain on his wife's face. "They are trapping him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The amendment ties the repeal to a land tax that will cripple the very farmers it's meant to help. If he votes for it, he betrays them. If he votes against it, he abandons the repeal and is branded a traitor to his own cause." They were in the library, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. For hours they worked. Alistair, with his intimate knowledge of parliamentary procedure and the personalities involved. Eleanor, with her razor-sharp analytical mind and her deep understanding of the economic realities. It was not a duke condescending to instruct his wife. It was a partnership. He paced the floor, outlining the political forces at play. "We need to peel off the undecideds. We need an argument that addresses their fear without validating Bromwell's rhetoric." She, bent over a table laden with maps and ledgers, looked up. "The argument isn't about land," she said, her voice ringing with sudden certainty. "It's about transport. The amendment is flawed because it assumes the tax burden is static, but the repeal will spur investment in the canals and railways to move cheaper grain. The increase in trade and transport revenue will more than offset the land tax, and it will benefit the very same landowners who currently fear the bill." She began to sketch out figures, her hand flying across the page. "Look, here is the projected revenue from the new tariffs on imported grain. Here is the cost of the land tax. And here is the projected increase in canal and rail freight tonnage. The numbers don't just work, they create a net profit for the Treasury and the landowners." Alistair stared at her calculations. It was brilliant, it was audacious, it reframed the entire debate, turning the opposition's weapon against them. "This," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "is more than an argument. It is a masterpiece." He rode for London that night. He did not sleep. Armed with Eleanor's analysis, he spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of backroom meetings and whispered conversations. He did not bully or threaten. He explained. He laid out the numbers. He used Eleanor's logic, her clarity, her irrefutable facts. When the vote was called, the amendment was defeated by a handful of crucial votes. The repeal of the Corn Laws passed. Eleanor's father was not just saved, he was vindicated. When Alistair returned to Blackwood, exhausted but triumphant, he found Eleanor waiting for him not in the formal entrance hall, but in the conservatory. It was early morning, and the rising sun streamed through the now clean glass panes. The room was no longer a ruin. It was a jungle, a riot of green and color. Plants bloomed in every corner. The air was sweet with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. It was a testament to her patience, her care, her ability to nurture life in barren places. She stood by a climbing rose, its pale pink blossoms a stark contrast to her dark dress. She had been waiting for him. He did not speak of Parliament or politics. He walked toward her, his eyes holding hers. The last wall of her fortress crumbled, not in a storm, but in the steady warmth of the morning sun. "I heard the news," she said softly. "We heard the news," he corrected her gently. "It was your victory, Eleanor. I was merely the messenger." He reached her, and for the first time, he took her hand, not as a formality, but as a connection. Her fingers curled around his. "I was wrong," he said again. But this time the words meant something different. They were not just an admission of a past mistake. They were a declaration of a new beginning. "My entire life, I have been looking for things of consequence. Land, titles, power. I was blind to the fact that the most consequential thing in my world was a woman who was quietly tending a ruined garden." She looked up at him, and her eyes, those beautiful, analytical hazel eyes, were shining. "Perhaps," she said, her voice thick with an emotion he now recognized as love. "You just needed to learn where to look." He raised her hand to his lips. The transactional contract, written in ink and arrogance, was finally, fully, superseded by a new one, written in shared understanding and mutual, profound respect. In the quiet, sun-drenched conservatory, surrounded by the life she had coaxed from nothing, the Duke of Allister finally, truly, saw his wife. And he knew, with the certainty of one of Eleanor's own mathematical proofs, that he was home. A year later, the Prime Minister was once again a guest at Blackwood Manor. The occasion was another political dinner, but the atmosphere was entirely changed. The house was no longer a cold museum. It was alive. Laughter echoed from the drawing room. The scent of roses from the conservatory drifted through the open windows. He watched as the Duke and Duchess of Allister greeted their guests. They moved as one, a seamless partnership. He would begin a sentence, and she would finish it with a dry, witty observation that made the stuffiest of ministers chuckle. She would pose a sharp question, and he would expand upon it, lending it his political weight. They were a formidable team. At dinner, the Prime Minister found himself seated opposite them. He watched as Allister, before taking his own seat, moved to the chair beside him. It was the head of the table, the place of the hostess, but it was also a place of equal partnership. With a quiet, unconscious grace, Allister pulled out the chair for his wife. Eleanor smiled at him, a private, intimate smile that spoke volumes. It held the memory of a different dinner, a different table, a different man. It held the shared victory of the corn laws, the quiet hours in the conservatory, the sound of scarlatti in the evenings. As she sat, the Prime Minister caught Allister's eye across the table. He gave the Duke a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. The lesson had been learned. Later that evening, the Prime Minister stood with Eleanor on the terrace, looking out at the moonlit gardens. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the infant heir to the dukedom, a small, sleeping symbol of the union's fruition. "He is a fine man, your husband," the Prime Minister said quietly, looking not at the baby, but at Eleanor. "He has learned to pay attention." Eleanor adjusted the blanket around her son, her face serene in the pale light. "He has learned to see," she corrected gently. "He learned that a person's place is not something that can be given or denied. It is something that must be understood." Her gaze drifted to the dining room, where Allister was deep in conversation, his face animated, his gestures confident. He glanced toward the terrace and saw her, and his expression softened into something that was hers and hers alone. The Prime Minister smiled. The boy had indeed learned to see. He had learned that the quietest voices often held the most profound truths, and that the greatest power was not the ability to command, but the willingness to listen. He had learned that love was not an acquisition, but a revelation, a slow, patient, and deeply rewarding act of discovery. And in learning to see his wife, the Duke of Allister had, at last, found himself.